I think we are online, so everyone, welcome back to our Ukrainian Global Law Talks series. I am very happy to welcome our guest today, David Crane, who is a good friend of the Ukrainian Bar Association. And a few words about David Crane. David is a famous American lawyer who served as a chief prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone from April 2002 until July 2005. And he, in fact, was the first to indict the then president of Liberia, Charles Taylor. He has a lot of experience in international public law, in international humanitarian law. Turning to the connection of David with the Ukrainian Bar Association, David leads the Global Accountability Network that supports the global order, international law, and accountability, obviously, from its name, for various crimes that are happening right now in the world. And in particular, we at the Ukrainian Bar Association have been privileged to work with the Global Accountability Network on various reports highlighting those atrocities that have been committed by Russia in Ukraine. And we actually have our regular monthly talks with David and his colleagues about what we can do more to support Ukraine to promulgate the idea of justice and accountability in the world. So, David, welcome to our webinar. We really appreciate your thoughts. And when we planned this a few weeks ago, we were supposed to talk primarily about the tribunal, special tribunal, the crime of aggression, and how hopefully we will be talking about very immediate commencement of the tribunal and possibly prosecution of the Troika, etc. And we'll talk about that today. But I would like to start with another thing today, given that we are living in such a ever-changing world, changing every day. I would like to start with the podcast that I literally listened today, and I'll be happy to advertise that podcast. The podcast was done by the PILPG, which is a Public International Law and Policy Group. It's called Lawyering in Peace. Lawyering in Peace. And David was the guest of that podcast and talked for about 40 minutes about what's going on right now in the world, and in particular, David's experience with the multinational force, peacekeeping force in Sinai, and how that experience could be replicated in Ukraine. So before we go on to that, David, maybe a few words from you about your experience with the UBA, and then quickly we will dive into our discussion.
Well, again, it's just always an honor and a pleasure to be addressing my colleagues in Ukraine. And I just want to make sure that they fully understand that American lawyers strongly support Ukraine. American Bar Association has come out, all various state bars association. So I want to just make sure that that is very clear, that despite what seems to be going in the wrong way, in reality, your colleagues in America, the American Bar Association and others, though I can't speak for them, I can assure you that American lawyers and the vast majority of the American people support Ukraine, your efforts for a just and sustainable peace. So again, working with the UBA from the very, very beginning in 2022, we reached out, we got together, we began to work together and put together within 5 weeks after the invasion a worldwide white paper on Russian war crimes. It is now entering its 4th edition, which will be published here in about a month or so, which we will send to all of you and to the world, highlighting, in fact, what is going on specifically on a day-to-day basis in Ukraine by the Russian Federation. But the Ukraine Bar Association is an important partner with the Global Accountability Network and many international NGOs. And so it's just always a pleasure to be talking to you on an informal basis. Mykola and I have become good friends, and perhaps if you'll just join Mykola and I sitting around the kitchen table, and we're going to have a conversation. So back to you, Mykola.
Thank you, David. Yes, it will be an interesting conversation in my view, because what you've mentioned in your podcast was about the experience that you've personally been involved in, which is creating a multinational peacekeeping force in the Sinai Peninsula between Egypt and Israel. And you believe that that experience could be replicated in Ukraine. Can you tell us a bit why you think that that experience is relevant in Ukraine? And I will then try to argue with you and try to challenge you about it.
No, that's good, and it's a great topic to start off our very candid and open discussion. The multinational force and observers, as it's called, what is and still exists, was created after the Camp David Accords were signed, a peace agreement between two arch enemies for centuries, and that is Israel and Egypt. Stemming from that was the creation of a stabilization force that was put in between the parties, the former warring parties, to ensure that either side is not trying to gain any kind of advantage in and around the Sinai Peninsula. And so that was called the Multinational Force and Observers in the Sinai. It was headed by a civilian director general, and the force was commanded by a Norwegian lieutenant general. So there's two components to a multinational force and observers: a stabilization entity. In other words, it's not really peacekeeping that you would think in the lines of Chapter 6 or Chapter 7 under the UN Charter. This is a totally separate entity outside the UN paradigm. The multinational force is consisting of units, armed force units from volunteer countries who would provide infantry forces, aviation assets, logistic assets, transportation assets, ordnance assets to occupy the middle of the zone where the MFO would be located, checkpoints, and those kind of things. They would be armed only with defensive weapons. There's no offensive weapons at all. Then there is the observers, which have carte blanche to move between all of the zones, and I'll talk about the zones in a minute, where they can go in any of the zones to ensure that all the parties are in fact honoring the agreement, creating the MFO, and to ensure that there are no offensive weapons in the zones, only defensive weapons, and there are no armed forces, offensive armed forces in any of the zones, and that there's only police forces and forces to just maintain stability. So I think this is really key. One is that there's two components. Two, it's voluntary. Three, it's outside the UN paradigm. And I was the legal advisor to the MFO, the Multinational Force and Observers, in the Sinai in 1983. Now, the key component also of an MFO is that it forces dialogue. In other words, if there is a problem, an immediate committee that exists comes together, a deconfliction committee comes together, and they sort out the problem, and they will come up with a mutual solution between all the parties and the MFO, and it worked very well. And I was a member of that committee. Let's talk about the zones. There's Zone A, B, and C, and it basically divided the Sinai Desert, the Sinai Peninsula, a little bit smaller than Ukraine, but the point is it was a large geographic area. Zone A, 10 miles wide, was occupied by Israel and its police forces. Zone B, much larger, most of the Sinai Peninsula, was occupied by the MFO, the stabilization force. And then Zone C, 10 miles wide, was occupied by the Egyptian forces. And so if you do the math, there are 70 miles between the warring parties. Anybody that in the zones A, B, and C cannot have offensive weapons, only defensive weapons. And so again, that allows the parties to begin to build trust, build a confidence that one side or the other is not going to start a conflict all over again or try to maneuver around to gain an advantage. Believe it or not, since 1981, the MFO in the Sinai still exists. And it is one of the more successful stabilization forces in in history. Now, let's talk about Ukraine. It's different, of course. There's no cookie cutter. There's no black and white in any of these solutions. But the key to slowing down and stopping the conflict is stabilization. Peace, as we would like to see it, a just and sustainable peace, is off the table, and maybe for years. But what we should be striving for, and I think it's realistic that we even consider it, is a multinational force and observers for the Donbass region. Very similar to the Sinai MFO, where you would have Zone A, which would be occupied by police forces of the Russian Federation, Zone B, which would be most of the Donbass region, occupied by the MFO, and then Zone C, 10-mile wide, would be occupied by Ukrainian police forces. And so again, you have a separation, even though in this day and age, back when I was in the Sinai, we didn't have we didn't have drones, and we didn't have the missile systems that are currently in place now, but at least the parties are separate. And so that what ends up doing is nobody has a stake in the Donbass region other than to pull away, let the MFO Donbass region come in, and both sides can develop at least a sense that there will be no fighting. And of course, the people in the Donbass region would be able to begin to develop a security that they could get up and live normal lives within those regions. Of course, it would be voluntary, and we would ask various nations. They would not be European nations. It would be nations from other parts of the world. In fact, I've written a paper on it, and I believe I've sent it to Mykola, but I'll send it again so you can maybe post it on your website. But nations such as China, India, Australia, Japan, Argentina, Brazil, Jordan, places, in other words, nations that don't really have a stake in the outcome of any of this, but are respected by both Ukraine as well as Russia. And so they would be the multinational force and observers. Now, there is a distinct difference. In the Camp David Accords, the peace accords, both sides wanted to stop fighting. Israel and Egypt, after decades, after centuries of fighting, put down their arms. They wanted to make this happen. So that the MFO in the Sinai was as a result of a peace accord. In this situation, because of the tensions, because of the circumstances that we face with Ukraine and Russia, the MFO, this force that is going to be a stabilization force, is going to create a stable environment, which over the next couple of years, the parties can begin to sit down at the table and consider peace. So it's really a cart before the horse. In other words, in the Sinai MFO was after the peace accord. Here, what we're talking about is a stabilization force in MFO Donbass region to stabilize the situation that would be before a peace would be started. And I think that would enhance a beginning of a dialogue, of a trust, of a stabilization that the parties over time could then sit down and work out a just and sustainable peace. So that is the multinational force and observer concept that I've written about, that I have been advocating about, that this might be an option for this. Now, you're probably thinking, well, we still have Russia back there. Well, we still have NATO back there. In other words, NATO doesn't go away. NATO is not part of the MFO, but if things go badly, the NATO is still there. NATO is a backbone to the whole system and provides a certain way by which Russia knows that if they try to ignore the agreement, then NATO is there. So again, it's not that NATO in Europe is not a player. It's just in the background providing political stability, supporting the MFO. But the MFO is run by a separate independent director general with a lieutenant general in command of the force, and nations coming together to help stabilize the Donbass region. So that's it very quickly in a nutshell, but I welcome your thoughts and perspectives, Mykola.
Yeah, thank you, David. You actually touched upon a few kind of concerns that I have. One is about the the impartiality of the members of the MFO. Indeed, I mean, if you look at the press, everyone is talking about having European peace forces on the ground, but I think it's becoming clear to everyone that Europe has a stake in this. European presidents, one by one, are already saying that this war is between Europe and Russia. And Russia is actually responding by saying that this is a conflict much larger than only between Ukraine and Russia. So Europe has a lot at stake. Europe is admitting that. So having European peacemakers, peacekeeping forces, won't make them peacekeepers in the sense that you are describing. Now, you've mentioned a few other names that may sound impartial, but I'd like to kind of engage with you in a discussion about this. Well, you mentioned Australia and China, for example. Australia has been supplying weapons to Ukraine, so I suspect that Russians will say, well, actually, this is, as they call, the Anglo-Saxon world, and they're all the same. So really, I wouldn't count much on Australia. Now, on China, it's a bit more complicated. On the one hand, technically, China has remained impartial and tried to even suggest and offer some peace solutions to both parties. Now, at the same time, in reality, China has been a big force behind Russia in terms of financial assistance, economic assistance, and military assistance indirectly, not directly, not to the extent that North Korea and Iran have helped Russia. So I suspect that some people will raise concerns about Chinese peacekeepers. We will end up with basically the global South that doesn't really have much at stake. Well, no, doesn't really care much, I suppose, but probably has a lot at stake in terms of the global stability. So, what's your take? Do you think it's realistic to have the global South actually send people? Do they have actually capacity to send peacekeepers? Have they had experience of doing so?
Couple things. First, one is that Europe is still very much involved. Europe is and their heads of state and the European Union, the Council of Europe, what have you, are still doing things to develop some kind of stability within not just the Donbass region, but just in Eastern Europe. And so Europe is still working on a peace process. While things are stabilizing over time, that's still happening. So that's really important. Europe has a major role, and I do agree with you, Mykola. It's going to have to be Europe that's going to have to step up. They have to come to the realization that the United States will be a destabilizing force within this process, at least for the next 4 years. And so they have to develop ways by which they operate outside the 80-year protection of the United States. And they have to develop modalities of keeping the U.S. Placated and informed, but also develop their own programs outside of the U.S. umbrella where they can do this job. So Europe is still incredibly important. In fact, Europe is the center point to success over the next 5-10 years. If we don't have Europe, then we don't have anything. So that's one thing. Two is the nations that I was talking about that would be voluntary, and it's voluntary. In other words, nations would think about it and step up. A good example is the MFO in the Sinai. We had 13 nations that were part of that. Both sides agreed that the United States should be a part of that. So both sides could potentially agree that China could be part of the MFO Donbass region. But we had mainly global South units that were part of the MFO in the Sinai. For example, Colombia is a good example, but we also had units from Jordan. We had units from Australia, Bangladesh, all of these nations that were voluntary, so that a nation who finds that it's in their interest and the interest of the region and or international peace and security can provide a battalion worth of soldiers who would be trained in peacekeeping type of operations by the MFO, who would then provide on a rotating basis units that would come in. Some countries rotated their units in every 6 months and some every year, but they would rotate them in on a regular, sustainable basis. So the nations that I used as an example, it's just examples. So that, no nation really at the end of the day is perfect. But this is where the political considerations comes in. Now let's talk about China. I think it's really important. China is a world power. China has associations with both Europe and associations with Russia. Yes, they have some problematic issues that could be of concern, and it should be a concern. It's a political concern. But I think, in my mind, having done this for many, many years, is that you have to have, like the United States was the big country in the MFO and the Sinai. You have to have a big country in the MFO and the Donbass regions, someone who is respected practically, militarily, as well as politically. And so China, in my mind, would be a good example. But also we would have India, also a G20 player and a country that is regionally powerful and respected, et cetera. And Brazil, Argentina, other countries like that. So again, these are just, in my mind, just considerations of countries that are in the G20 that have a little bit more clout. But certainly, when in the MFO Sinai, the little country of Fiji was a part of the MFO and the Sinai. They provided a battalion of their army, and there's only 3 battalions in their army, but they provided 1/3 of their army to be in the MFO in the Sinai, and they were good soldiers and did a good job. So this is where I think the genius of an MFO for the Donbass region is that those countries that are there is a minimal kind of commitment. Battalion of soldiers, an aviation company, a company of ordnance personnel who help to demine the area. That's another thing that goes on as well. There's more than just keeping the parties apart. But what is happening is that the MFO has a civilian component, which is also starting to bring back the region to a more livable place. And countries provide that kind of ability as well. And there's a committee that works at the Director General's office that works on rehabilitating and refurbishing the distressed area. And we did that in the Sinai. Did you know that there were 34 million mines in the Sinai? And so one of the major things that we did was just demining, and they're still pulling the mines out of the Sinai. And so we know that there are many mines in the Donbass region. And so we're going to have to, that's going to be one of the things that the MFO can do in Zone B, would be that they would also have countries that would donate or order their an ordnance companies come in. So you have aviation companies, logistics battalions, infantry battalions. There's no artillery, there's no armor. These infantry are basically like militia. They are just occupying checkpoints, occupying observation points, watching, making sure that the parties stay apart. And then, of course, the observers are also part of those volunteer countries who wear civilian clothes, or fly around in white helicopters, and have the authority to fly in both Zone A, B, and C without notice, to just check to make sure that nobody is moving offensive capability into those regions and maybe try to attack. So your question is a good one. But again, these are voluntary nations who provide whatever they think they can provide. Fiji provided an infantry battalion. Australia provided aviation companies. For example, New Zealand provided a communications company, et cetera, so that each country provides what is needed. And so what happens is if there is an agreement, then you break down the types of units that are going to be necessary to occupy mainly Zone B. And then those countries would say, yes, we would agree to provide a logistics battalion. So, and another country would agree to provide, Uruguay provided a transportation company, providing trucks to move supplies and stuff in and around Zone B to support the force, et cetera. So it's the key to this is that a force is really, in the overall scheme of things, a very inexpensive but yet politically stable organization that can provide some sense of cease firing so that Europe, Russia, others can sit down and begin to think about peace. But they don't have to worry about drone attacks, missile attacks on either side, and bombing civilians. That takes a lot of the dust out of the air, and then allows Europe and Russia to sit down and say, okay, and Ukraine, and sit down and go, okay, let's think about peace. It may be 5 years from now, but at least we have something in place where the fighting has stopped. And that is politically acceptable for Ukraine, and it is politically acceptable, I'm sure, for Russia, because Russia is not going to win this war, and everybody knows that. So Russia has to figure out a way to come up with something that is politically acceptable and gives them some type of, whether they deserve it or not, some type of international stature enough to say, they could say, well, look, we agree to the MFO. We agree to this. And so that gives them some sense of positivity, so that when Europe reaches out and says, let's sit down, there's a little bit more of an ability to look each other in the eye with Ukraine and come up with some kind of just and sustainable peace. So that's all of it. Maybe not in a nutshell, but your points are really good and your questions are good. But let's not get hung up on who is actually in the force, because in reality, it could be anybody. Any nation could volunteer.
Agree. But then the next question that arises is about the size. I realize that the whole of Sinai Peninsula is basically divided into these 3 zones, in fact, or even more zones. Now, you, in your proposal, you're talking about MFO zone for the Donbas region. In reality, it's much more than the Donbas region. It's the south of Ukraine, is the east, which is Donbas region, is the north, which is the northern border with Russia, and hypothetically, it's also the whole of northern border of Ukraine, which borders Belarus. And if you take even Belarus out of this equation for the time being, you're talking about at least 3 zones. One is in the south, then is in the east, which is proper Donbas, and the one is in the north, which is actually has nothing to do with Donbas. But this is where the Kursk operation is happening. That's where Russia is attacking Kharkiv and Sumy, the northeastern cities of Ukraine. So potentially, and I suspect you're talking about all of these areas, but you're calling them kind of MFO for the Donbas region. But we are talking about thousands of miles, more than 1,000 miles of delimitation line, and which is much larger than the Sinai Peninsula by any means. So that kind of begs the question: is it manageable, such a long line, to keep it impenetrable and to keep it stable? Because this is exactly what the Ukrainian government has been mentioning in the last few weeks, that it's not really possible to monitor such a huge line.
That's a fair point, and it may not be. But it's a concept that provides that stability. I'm estimating that the force, the multinational force in the Sinai was about 5,000. I estimate in my kind of calculation, taking in, you're very correct. We call it the Donbass region, but in reality, it is more than that. And you can, in the agreement, you can create different zones or shape and mold the zones where it's A, but it goes all the way down around to Belarus. Zone B would be much deeper, and Zone C, where Ukraine would be, in other words, yes, that could be shaped and molded in a way that makes sense to make sure that there is stability and that the parties are pulled away from the conflict zone. So that's a fair point. It's going to take about 45,000 members of the force and probably about 1,000 observers moving about in helicopters and other ways, in cars and vehicles. The nice thing, though, importantly, and that's why how technology has changed so much since we were in the Sinai Desert, is that we have much more capacity through satellite imagery, through surveillance systems, etc., that we can monitor this area also technically. So you don't have to have physical boots on the ground. Obviously, you'll have sectors and all of this all around, but the entire region could be monitored by satellite as well as other ground surveillance and other ways by which everything is being looked at. So we'd have to use all the capacity, both technology and human resources, and signals, intelligence, and all of that to monitor the region. It's a huge region. I agree, and your country is correct. It may be too much, but that shouldn't stop us. We should consider trying this. And even to the point of where we start maybe just with the Donbass region, which has originally been an issue for decades, and then grow it. See what I'm saying? So that again, there are very variations of this, but I agree with you. It's a huge region, but the alternative is fighting. The alternative is an unstable area. An alternative is continued anger, no trust on either side. And so therefore we just keep fighting. And the political sense is that the world isn't going to allow this to happen much longer. It has nothing to do with the Trump administration. It's just that that's human nature. Wars can't last forever. And I suspect that all parties are just going to be tired of doing this, not because it's the right or wrong thing to do. It's just a human nature that you can't fight for 10 years without this. Now, another good example of where this would work, and you're looking for examples, is, the United States got involved, the United Nations got involved in a war in Korea. It wasn't the United States, it was 13 nations from the United Nations defended South Korea when North Korea invaded South Korea. And both sides began to realize that they could not win. And so they came up with the demilitarized zone and a ceasefire. The war has not technically ended. So, there is kind of another historical example, and it's been this way since 1950. So again, there are ways to do this, but now that we have the MFO concept, we don't want the issue with in Korea is that both sides still have their armies facing each other, and there's a very small demilitarized zone, but they're not shooting at each other. So that's a possibility. But again, I can't see realistically that you could create a demilitarized zone from Belarus all the way down to the Black Sea. That is I don't know how many thousands of miles that is, but the demilitarized zone would be too big. So, and the parties would still be shooting, be pointing guns at each other. The key to an MFO, though, is that the parties are no longer pointing guns at each other. They are not shooting each other. They may not even be talking to each other, but at least they're not fighting, and it allows the dust to settle so that the political players in the region, Europe and Russia and Ukraine, can then over the next year, 2 or 3 years, begin to develop methodologies that they can sit down and begin a concept of peace. So your fair point. Yeah, and I agree. The region may be too damn big, but it can be done. It's just you have to realistically figure it out. But fortunately, we now have technology that will augment that space. And the fact that observers can still move about the region, on their own authority and not tell either side, that also develops. And that's the observers are the most important aspects of this, because then they're looking, they're checking, and making sure that both sides are not sneaking up on each other and building an offensive capacity again. Plus, in satellites, we saw the Russians building up on their border in January and February of 2022. We literally looked at it, so they can't hide anything anymore. So that we would use obviously appropriate satellite technology as well, ground sensing radar, all of the things that are available to monitor vast regions of Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, David, this actually brings me nicely to the next point that let's assume that this happens. And of course, we in Ukraine want peace, but we also want justice. We want accountability. And I personally struggle to make it work together. The MFO, the potential peace talks, and if you take that historic example from Sinai, I suspect that there was no international tribunal created to try the crimes committed by Egyptian, or I guess Arab states in general, and Israel in that war. But we were talking in the last few months about a potential for creating a special tribunal under the auspices of the Council of Europe. First of all, where are we? What's the status? And secondly, how can you reconcile these two concepts, the MFO and the tribunal that will make Russia and its leaders accountable?
Well, just real quickly, during the Camp David Accords back in the late 1970s, international criminal law didn't exist. There was no capacity to create a tribunal. Never been done since Nuremberg. So, there just wasn't the jurisprudence that we have now. So let's put that aside from a historical point of view. As you move through an atrocity zone, a conflict zone, there are many elements of moving away from fighting to moving into a peace kind of situation. There's peace and there's justice. And which comes first? Is it justice then peace, or peace then justice? It's an age-old concept, but someone who's been doing this for 40 years, you need to understand that they can develop on their own. And we did that in West Africa, and there's been other places that's been done. In reality, justice should not be in the way of peace. Justice is actually a stabilizing effort which calms things down and allows people to realize that there may be hope for the future. So that where we are now as far as accountability for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a violation of the UN Charter, violation of international law, etc., violations of the Rome Statute, what have you, the idea of accountability is critical to a stable peace. If you don't have accountability, then you don't have really a stable area. And Liberia is a good example. Sierra Leone, we had our tribunals. Sierra Leone has been stable. Liberia has not been stable because there's been no accountability there. So we have the International Criminal Court that has boldly and correctly stepped forward and issued arrest warrants for Putin and others for war crimes, crimes against humanity related to specifically the movement of Ukrainian children into the Russian Federation, abduction. And so that's already happened. So when we have found that it did not destabilize anything. Russia may not be happy about it, but they realize that they can't do anything about it because the law is more powerful than the rule of the gun, as I've said for many, many years. So that in reality, then what happens is that when we start thinking about an MFO, and we could call it doesn't have to be the Donbass region, it could be the MFO for whatever we want to call it, but I just call it that for discussion purposes. But we have the ICC continuing its investigation of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and there'll be more indictments related to other things that they have committed against Ukraine at the international level. But we also have, and I don't want to go too far into the why doesn't the ICC have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression? It just doesn't. So let's just leave it at that at this point for our discussion today. So we have to hold accountable the Russian Federation for the actual ultimate act of aggression, which created the rest of the crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, what have you. And so that is, and we've been working together for over 2.5 years with many entities, to include the Ukraine Bar Association, to create, and we provided the statute which the Council of Europe is using to create a special tribunal on the crime of aggression against Ukraine. And we are largely there. The core group of nations, around 45 nations, along with the Council of Europe, have come to at least an agreement to agree that this is one, we need to have the tribunal. This is what it should look like. And now at this point, it has to be politically bought into by the various countries. And then a signing ceremony and the creation of the court would follow after that. So we're very close, but yet not quite there yet. And of course, we have to, because the shadow of over all of this, a dark shadow over all this, is the United States and the Trump administration. And so they are going to be problematic. But this is where Europe is going to have to say, this is our problem. This is something we have to solve, because the continent of Europe will never be stable without peace in Ukraine. Period. Full stop. Let's stop dancing around that. And so the Europeans have to realize that it will be an unsettled region until this happens. And so Europe is going to have to step up without the United States and take care of the situation, which they can. And they have done great work. The Council of Europe is bravely stood up and said, look, we're going to create this tribunal, and we're going to do it together with our European partners and others to create the tribunal so we can hold Vladimir Putin and his henchmen accountable for the crime of aggression. So you can have the MFO, a stabilizing entity there in the Ukraine, but you can also have a special tribunal for aggression against Ukraine doing its work, and you can also have the ICC doing its investigations, and you can have over time Europe, Russia, and Ukraine sitting down and coming up to a just and sustainable peace.
Well, we of course want this to happen, but at the moment we see a lot of mixed signals from the United States, and that's why I think the creation of the tribunal has been considered under the auspices of the Council of Europe. Do you think that's an appropriate kind of forum and organization? And do you think that kind of tribunal would be effective in the long run?
Well, again, the idea would be that as it normally does back when the world was a little bit different, the UN Security Council would begin the process, and that's generally how it happens in the other types of tribunals that we have had. An alternative, and something that we worked together, and Mykola, you know this, we tried to create a special tribunal for Ukraine on the crime of aggression through the UN General Assembly. And we were succeeding and moving towards that possibility. An agreement authorizing the agreement would be essentially the General Assembly and a resolution authorizing the Secretary General to enter into discussions with the Republic of Ukraine to create that tribunal. And we were moving forward on that, but then the tragedy of October 2023 came in Gaza, and all of the political wind in our sails just dissipated. And so we had to come up with a different approach, and the working group that I'm on and others said, well, why don't we develop a, for lack of a better term, a multinational court created by member states of the UN outside of the UN, very much like Nuremberg. The nations came together to create the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, and just come together and create a special tribunal. And so that's the process that was started in early 2024, and that's where we are now, where we are stepping outside the UN, even though all of these states are member states, and creating that tribunal. And the political cornerstone, and this is where the Council of Europe should be commended, is that the Council of Europe would be the political and legal cornerstone by calling on all nations who are interested. And it wouldn't be just Europe, it could be other nations. And in the core group, it's not just European nations. There are many other nations outside of Europe, the United States, Canada, Costa Rica, Japan, what have you, that are members of this, that would volunteer to be a part of and support politically or practically. In other words, providing monies or like they did in the Special Court for Sierra Leone, office furniture. China gave us $300,000 worth of office furniture and those kind of things. So that that can be done. There is political precedent for it, and a legal precedent for it, and that would give it its validity based on the cornerstone being the Council of Europe. So the Council of Europe has the authority to do this, and with the concurrence of obviously member states of the Council of Europe, as well as the political backing of the core group and other countries around the world. So, certainly that would be, and we certainly had the same issues that we were facing in West Africa, where Defense Council would raise the jurisdictional question: does the Council of Europe, does the core group have the legal authority to create a court? And so that would be litigated fairly and openly in court. We won in Sierra Leone, so the model for this is Sierra Leone, the same kind of format. So that, but certainly, good defense counsel would attack it jurisdictionally, but I think we would prevail. Another issue being related to the person who started this is a sitting president of a member state of the United Nations, Vladimir Putin. The question of head of state immunity looms large. And it has been found in international law is that domestic courts, the head of state immunity cannot overshadows domestic prosecutions, and so he would be immune from that. There's a question even of once it goes beyond domestic into a region or the international community. Prosecute Putin, so that we have to have an international body centered, Council of Europe, the UN General Assembly, what have you, to create this thing. And so it takes head of state immunity out of the equation and allows us to actually go after the ultimate perpetrator. Now, there are other political considerations related to that, and there is a reluctance to go after Vladimir Putin and those kind of things. These are issues that the core group and the Council of Europe have been working on, and they have, which I'm not, I don't have the authority to talk about that publicly, but there's been an agreement related to that. And so again, we're just waiting for the political decision by Europe to in fact create this, so with or without the support of the United States, and to make this happen. So that's where we're standing. But from the jurisprudential legal point of view, it is and can be done the way this is now put together.
Understood. David, this is a great segue into my next question. Supposedly, because of the political situation in the world, this issue is delayed. The creation of the tribunal is put on hold for indefinite period of time, 2, 3, 5, 10 years. Is it possible? Is there some kind of time limitation? I suspect not, but I would like to hear from you as an expert. Can you create that tribunal later, much later, and still prosecute? And of course, assuming that people who are responsible for these crimes are still alive.
The simple answer is yes. There's no statute of limitations to international crimes, so that this could happen next week, next year, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. Now, of course, it's the practicality of that. Witnesses die. The world just moves on. In other words, this is really important, I think, for our listeners to understand. To create a tribunal, it's a political decision, not a legal one. That's really critical. And so over time, the political will to create this, as things settle down, as people move on, generations continue to move forward, it becomes politically impractical to create the tribunal. So this is where we have to do this now, because there is a political will to do it now, regardless of the challenges that are going on. And so as time goes by, then I think that becomes a real challenge. And Syria is the best example of that. And I was very much involved in Syria. I'm the co-author of the world-famous Caesar report. We've been involved in investigating the Syrian regime since 2011. We've had a kind of an interesting political change in the sense of Assad was thrown out of the country, so he's very much liable criminally for what he's done to the Syrian people. But the horror of what he was doing to his own people just politically did not want to set up a tribunal to hold him accountable. There just was no political will. And if that doesn't happen, then nothing happens. And we can go around the world, and I can give you other examples of where the world just looked the other way. So the time is now. We have to do it now. The political will is now. I wrote an op-ed back, and I couldn't believe how far long ago I wrote it. In September of 2022, I wrote an op-ed that said, "Time and distraction are Putin's ultimate weapons." He really can't win politically, militarily, and practically. But he knows Europe probably better than we know ourselves, and that is Europe moves on. And so if he can hang on long enough by his fingernails in the Donbass region and other parts, over time, he'll realize that a distraction will happen that will cause the world to walk away from Ukraine. It did in Syria. It's done that in the Sudan. It's done that in other places as well. And so that distraction has happened. It started in October of 2023 with the tragedy of Gaza, and the world started looking the other way. And now that we have a new administration in the United States, Donald Trump, that's another distraction, which causes the world to stop, hesitate, and reconsider Ukraine. And so, again, this is where I am looking my good colleagues in the eye saying the time is now. 2025, it has to happen. That special tribunal has to happen. A creation of a stabilization force has to happen in the next 2 years. Or we just have to accept that despite the U.S. Showing signs of pulling their support from Ukraine, Europe has to come to the realization that if Ukraine is unstable, Europe is unstable. And they have to do something about that. I see strong efforts in that regard. But again, this is now, whether we like it or not, this is now a European problem, hopefully with the political support of the global South. But Europe has to step up and deal with this in a way that we may have eventually a stable situation, and then eventually a potential just and sustainable peace. Good questions, good comments, Mykola.
Thank you, David. And I promise you that we'll speak a bit about the future global world order. And I mentioned to you before we started this conversation, and I mentioned to our audience that I recently saw an article from on the website Just Security, actually co-written by Ukrainian Maxim Vyshik and a Canadian author, Jeremy Pizzi. And the article is called "The Voices from Kyiv: Is the World Legal Order in Decay?" And I believe you, David, also spoke along those lines. But the main point from that article for me was that the international law actually never dies. It's the international world order or legal order that is changing. So assuming that we all agree that the international law doesn't die, it just changes and goes from dictatorships and kingdoms to democracies and potentially back to kingdoms and dictatorships. Where do you think this is going, both from probably from the legal perspective, but also from the historic perspective as well? Are we going to end up in total chaos, or it will be a controlled chaos? What's the likely scenario in your view?
Well, one could certainly just throw up your hands and go, this is all over. And in reality, we're in, if you understand history, there are cycles of ebbs and flows of peace and justice and democracy and dictatorships, what have you. And time moves on. So, my sense is we are in what I call the age of the strong man. Once again, where it seems like nationalism, populism, dictators, authoritarianism is rampant. And again, directly challenging the democratic rule of law order that was under the United Nations. It's being assaulted. But, at the end of the day, the world tends to shift away from these types of scenarios. But we're still in that scenario, and it's a real challenge. But I really like the point, and I've written about this too, is that despite all of these ebbs and flows, these historic changes, these challenges that seem to make the world completely bleak, the political, the world will change again. So, and that's kind of my over 10 years. Yes, it will be a different world, and yes, it will be maybe something we didn't anticipate, because I certainly didn't anticipate this. But I think that overall, particularly with the global South also saying we believe in the UN paradigm, will counterweight the global shift of power centers that have changed away from the United Nations to four distinct entities: China, Russia, United States, and Europe. Three of them are trending towards authoritarianism, whereas Europe clearly is a counterweight to these other powers. But there's kind of a fifth power here, and that is the global South. And this is also where, and I would posit that the global South is also going to have to now let its voice be heard, because they have to decide what world can we exist in that is in our best interests. And I would assert that authoritarianism led by three countries is not the path they want to take. And I think they agree and would move in a direction where the European model of democracy. And so this is where we have to also consider as maybe a fifth power center is just the global South. In whatever way that shapes itself, either through regional organizations or just grouping together and saying we're not going to step away from the UN paradigm. That would be huge as well. But my assessment is that we are going through a period that is bleak, and that we have to correctly understand that international law, public and private international law, still is needed in order to allow nations, regardless of where they are politically, to do business and to exist in a world. If we don't do that, then it becomes very much like the Dark Ages, piracy, just taking things and invading countries because they have a particular thing that country wants, whatever, minerals, oil, water, what have you. That's not going to happen. So that I agree that international law, both public and private international law, will exist and be needed and will provide a sense of, if not political stability, certainly commercial stability, so that nations can do business. So that will be still the law, the flag of the law will still be flying. Truly.
I think that's a great slogan. We really hope so. Although the way you describe it, we actually feel that in some sense it's not true, at least in our part of the world. You mentioned just now that it's not going to happen that states will be just invading other states because they like something or don't like something about these other states. But this is exactly what has happened 3 years ago when Russia invaded Ukraine at a full-scale level. But of course, all started with Crimea in 2014, and also with Georgia in 2008, etc. But thank you for your comments. We have one comment from the audience, and let me read it out loud to you and our audience. So the question is from Mikhailo Akimov, and the question is as follows: Professor Crane, what do you think of the probability of the future tribunal as the initiator of the development and adoption of the Convention on the Military Use of Unmanned Systems? Okay, so it's complicated, but...
Well, I don't want to go too far down that road, but, law evolves. Law is always a step behind technology. It has to catch up in many, many ways, commercially, financially, legally, practically. So, we're going into a world, and I'll answer it in a general answer as opposed to specifically. The United Nations is going to have to adapt, or the world community is going to have to adapt to many challenges. It's affected the laws of armed conflict. The technologies have affected how we deal with with drones and missiles and satellites and cyber and all of the things that we're facing in Ukraine, but also elsewhere. So the law has to and can and it will adapt and adjust to those technologies. We also have challenges with artificial intelligence and where does that go and those kind of things. So that and this is where international laws will always remain because it'll be through international agreements and understandings and protocols that the world community will tackle issues that are of international character and not just national character. So, I am optimistic that the rule of law will continue, that the rule of law still is more powerful than the rule of the gun, and that we will prevail. And technologies are just one of those issues that, again, that we're going to have to deal with related to how it affects our capabilities of governing ourselves under that rule of law. So it's a good question. I thank you for it. I don't think I answered it, but the bottom line is that those are just issues, and they're just good examples of how the rule of law, international law, is going to drive this as far as all the challenges to the future related to technology itself.
And if I may add, I think this is a right question in terms of the um, acuteness of the topic, the unmanned systems and their military use. This is what exactly is driving the war right now in Ukraine, and the regulation of their use would definitely be in the interest of the global civilization. Whether the tribunal can be an initiator of that convention, I have doubts personally, but
Sure.
I'm sure that someone can initiate. It doesn't really have to be a tribunal. It can be any state or a group of states.
Well, yeah, the subject matter and in personam jurisdiction of the tribunal is to prosecute those who have committed the crime of aggression. So technology and unmanned systems are outside of the rules. But as someone who has worked in the laws of armed conflict, developed doctrine, taught it, been practicing it, both as a serving officer and special operations, I can tell you that the laws of armed conflict still remain regardless of how technology changes. The weapon systems might be different. The unmanned systems are there that we're facing both in Ukraine and elsewhere. But the basic principles of the laws of armed conflict, military necessity, proportionality, discrimination, and unnecessary suffering govern all of this. And so it's really important. Just because the technology changed doesn't mean that the laws of armed conflict have to change or that they have to be adjusted. If you are using whatever system it may be, unmanned or manned, but there's a military necessary reason to use it, then it's legal. But if you're using it to intentionally attack civilians, civilian objects, civilian infrastructure with no military necessity to do that, that's still a war crime and still a violation of international law. So,
yeah. Well, thank you so much, Professor Crane. It's been an honor to have you with us. We at the Ukrainian Bar Association really appreciate your thoughts, your involvement with Ukraine, your passion about Ukraine and accountability of Russia for the crimes committed in Ukraine. We think that it is important to have these discussions. It's important for Ukrainian lawyers to listen more to the world, and it's important for the world to listen more to Ukrainian lawyers.
yes.
And again, I cannot thank you enough for your dedication to Ukraine. Thank you so much, and thank you for finding time to speak to us, and thank you to our audience for finding time to listen to us. Thank you, everyone. Have a great and peaceful evening and a great day back in the United States, David.
Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава! Okay,
Well,
we're now off.
excellent.